I was standing in the canned goods aisle last week, just grabbing a few things for the pantry, and I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The shelf tags. Half of them had changed since the last time I really paid attention. Not out of stock, not banned, just quietly, steadily more expensive than they were a year ago. And nobody around me seemed to notice. People were tossing cans in their carts the same way they always do, on autopilot. That's the thing about grocery prices. They don't announce themselves. They creep. So I went home and actually looked into it. I pulled pricing trends. I talked to a friend who works in food distribution, and I started paying attention to what smart, budget-conscious shoppers are quietly doing differently right now. I also went back through months of my own grocery receipts because I wanted real numbers, not just a feeling. What I found matched what my friend had told me almost item for item. Today, I'm walking you through 10 canned foods that people who actually watch their money are stocking up on in 2026, and why. Stick around, because number 7 on this list genuinely surprised me. I did not expect that one, and once you hear the reason, you'll probably start checking your own pantry. Let's get into it. Item number 1. Canned, diced, and crushed tomatoes. This is where I want to start, because tomatoes are the base of so many meals people don't even think about. Sauces, soups, chilies, stews. If you cook at home even a little, you're using canned tomatoes more than you realize. Weather volatility in major growing regions has been putting real pressure on tomato crops the last couple of seasons. When a harvest gets disrupted, it doesn't just affect fresh tomatoes, it ripples straight into canning supply too. Industry pricing reports have flagged canned tomato products as one of the more consistent upward movers in the pantry category over the past year. I actually started tracking this myself, almost by accident. I buy the same brand of crushed tomatoes every few weeks for pasta night, and I noticed the price creeping up 3 separate times since last spring. When I checked my receipts going back, it wasn't a huge jump each time. A few cents here, a bit more there. But stacked together, it added up fast. I even texted a friend to ask if she'd noticed the same thing at her store across town, and she had. That's when it clicked for me that this wasn't just my grocery store being weird, it was a broader pattern. So here's what I'd suggest. Buy a few extra cans when you see a sale and rotate your stock so the older cans get used first. Canned tomatoes have a long shelf life, so there's very little downside to having a small backup supply. This is one of those items where being a little ahead of the curve really does protect your monthly grocery bill. You're not being paranoid by stocking a few extra cans. You're just refusing to be surprised later. Item number 2. Canned beans are the quiet workhorse of a budget-conscious kitchen, and I think a lot of people underestimate how much they lean on them. Black beans, pinto beans, kidney beans. Cheap protein, long shelf life, endless recipes. The problem is that cheap protein is exactly the kind of item that quietly absorbs price increases first, because shoppers expect it to always be the affordable option and don't scrutinize it as closely. Retail data over the last year has shown private label canned bean prices creeping upward even while brand name promotions stay visible, which can mask the bigger trend if you're not paying attention. I spoke with someone who works in grocery distribution, and they told me something that stuck with me. They said store brands are often where price increases get absorbed first, because shoppers trust the low price without double-checking it every trip. That hit home for me, because I always assumed store brand beans were my safe, reliable budget item. Now, I actually compare the unit price every single time I shop. I went as far as pulling out my phone in the aisle and doing the math on 3 different brands side by side. The store brand wasn't even the cheapest one anymore, and that genuinely caught me off guard. My advice here is simple. Stock up when beans go on sale, and don't assume the store brand is automatically your cheapest option anymore. Check the per ounce price on the shelf tag before you grab it out of habit. This is a small habit shift, but it protects one of the most reliable budget staples in your kitchen. It only takes a few extra seconds, and it saved me real money over the past few months. Item number 3. Canned tuna. Canned tuna has always been the go-to protein for people trying to eat well without spending a lot. And that's exactly why it's worth watching closely right now. A meaningful portion of canned tuna sold in the US is imported, which means it's sensitive to shipping costs, trade dynamics, and global seafood supply shifts in a way a lot of shoppers don't think about. Seafood industry trackers have noted tighter margins on canned tuna over the past couple of seasons, driven partly by higher costs getting passed down the supply chain. I noticed this one personally because tuna salad is a weekly thing in my house. When I checked my usual store last month, the price per can had moved up enough that I actually stopped and did the math on cost per serving. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough that I started buying in bulk when I see a genuine sale instead of grabbing 1 or 2 cans at a time like I used to. My partner actually laughed at me the first time I came home with a case of tuna instead of a couple cans. But once I explained the math behind it, they started doing the same thing with their own go-to items. If tuna is part of your regular rotation, this is a good one to stock up on now, rather than later. Look for multi-can packs and store them somewhere cool and dry, so you're not scrambling later. Protein is one of the categories where being ahead of the trend really pays off, because prices in this space tend to move up and rarely move back down. Once you build a small buffer, you stop feeling those price jumps at all. Item number 4. Canned chicken. This one doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it should, and that's part of why I wanted to include it. Fresh chicken prices have been volatile, and a lot of budget-conscious shoppers have quietly shifted toward canned chicken as a backup protein source without really announcing it. Poultry supply reports have pointed to feed costs and processing expenses as ongoing pressure points, and that pressure eventually shows up on the shelf in both fresh and canned formats. I'll be honest, I used to think canned chicken was kind of a last resort item. Then a friend of mine who cooks on a tight budget showed me how she uses it in casseroles, soups, and quick sandwiches, and I realized I'd been sleeping on it. Since then, I've started keeping a few cans in my pantry specifically for weeks when fresh chicken prices spike at my regular store. There was 1 week last month where fresh chicken breast at my store jumped noticeably overnight, and I didn't even flinch. I just reached for the pantry instead of adjusting my whole meal plan around a higher price. My suggestion is to grab a couple of cans next time you're already at the store, even if you don't need them immediately. Think of it as a buffer for the weeks when fresh protein prices jump unexpectedly. It's not glamorous, but it's exactly the kind of quiet backup plan that keeps your grocery budget stable when prices swing. You'll barely notice the cost, and you'll be grateful you have it the first time fresh prices spike. Item number 5. Canned corn. Corn feels like such a basic item that most people never think twice about it, which is exactly why it belongs on this list. Corn is tied closely to broader agricultural input costs, things like fertilizer, fuel, and transportation, all of which have been trending upward over recent seasons. Commodity trackers have shown corn processing and packaging costs contributing to gradual price increases across canned corn products industry-wide. When I looked at my own shopping history, canned corn was actually one of the items where I hadn't noticed a change at all, until I compared prices side by side from 6 months apart. The difference was small per can, but consistent. That's the tricky part with an item like this. It's cheap enough that a few cents doesn't register in the moment, but it adds up over a year of regular purchases. I did a rough calculation based on how many cans my family goes through in a year, and even a small per can increase turned into a noticeable chunk of change by the time I added it all up. That surprised me more than I expected. Here's what I'd do. Buy corn in the multi-pack when it's on sale, since it stores easily and works in everything from soups to side dishes. It won't feel like a big win in the moment, but small, consistent savings on staple items are exactly how smart shoppers stay ahead. It's the boring stuff that actually moves the needle over a year. Item number 6. Canned coconut milk. I want to slow down here for a second because this is one people really don't expect. Coconut milk has become a kitchen staple for a lot more households than it used to be, showing up in curries, soups, sauces, and even dairy-free baking. but almost all of it is imported, which makes it far more exposed to shipping costs and international supply shifts than something grown domestically. Import cost reports over the past year have flagged coconut-based products as one of the more volatile categories in the pantry aisle, with price swings that are noticeably sharper than domestic staples. I only found this out because I started cooking more curries at home, and I noticed the price of my usual brand jump twice within a few months. At first, I thought it was just my store, but when I checked around, the trend was pretty consistent everywhere. I actually asked one of the stock clerks at my store if they'd seen a lot of price changes lately, half expecting a shrug, and instead she pointed straight at the international foods section without hesitation. If you use coconut milk regularly, this is genuinely one to stock up on when you catch a good price. It has a long shelf life, so there's no real downside to grabbing a few extra cans. This is exactly the kind of item that catches people off guard, because it doesn't feel like a staple the way beans or tomatoes do, even though for a lot of households it absolutely is one now. It's worth treating it that way before the price climbs any further. Item number 7. Canned salmon. Alright, this is the one I told you about at the beginning, and I still think about it every time I'm in that aisle now. Canned salmon has quietly become one of the more expensive proteins on the shelf, and most people don't clock it because they're comparing it to fresh salmon prices instead of other canned goods. Seafood supply data has pointed to tighter wild catch quotas and higher processing costs as the main drivers, and those costs move through the canned category just as much as the fresh case. Here's the part that actually surprised me. I always assumed canned salmon was the budget version of fresh salmon, so I never really scrutinized the price. When I finally compared cost per serving against canned tuna and canned chicken, canned salmon came out noticeably higher, and the gap had grown over the past year without me ever noticing. I mentioned this to my friend in food distribution, and they said salmon has been one of the more unpredictable proteins on the supply side lately, which tracks with what I was seeing on the shelf. That conversation really stuck with me because I realized I'd been mentally filing canned salmon under cheap protein for years without ever double-checking that assumption. Once I actually ran the numbers, I felt a little silly for not catching it sooner. If you eat canned salmon regularly, or you're thinking about adding it to your rotation for the omega-3s, this is a good one to watch closely and buy when you see a real discount rather than paying full price out of habit. This is exactly the kind of item that quietly eats into a budget, because it hides behind the assumption that it's already the cheap option. Once you know to look, you can't really unsee it. Item number 8. Canned pumpkin. This one is seasonal, but the smart move here happens outside the season, not during it. Canned pumpkin has a very narrow harvest window, and demand spikes hard every fall for baking. That combination makes it one of the more predictable items to see price movement and occasional shortages around. Agricultural reports have noted that pumpkin crop yields can vary significantly year to year based on weather, and when a rough season hits, it shows up directly in canned pumpkin availability months later. I learned this the hard way a couple of years ago when I went to grab pumpkin for a holiday recipe and found half-empty shelves with picked-over brands left behind. It was a small thing, but it stuck with me. Since then, I buy a few extra cans of pumpkin in late summer, before the fall rush even starts, and just tuck them in the pantry. Last year I mentioned this to a neighbor over the fence, and she thought I was being a little excessive, until she went to the store in late October and found exactly what I had warned her about. She grabbed a can of pumpkin from me instead of fighting the shelves. If baking season matters to you at all, this is a genuinely easy one to get ahead of. Grab a couple of extra cans whenever you see them well before autumn, so you're not stuck scrambling in October. It's a small habit, but it saves you from paying inflated last-minute prices or settling for whatever brand happens to still be on the shelf. A little planning goes a long way with this one. Item number 9. Canned evaporated and condensed milk. Dairy prices have been a roller coaster, and canned milk products absorb that volatility in a way a lot of people don't think about. Evaporated and condensed milk show up in more recipes than people realize, from holiday desserts to everyday coffee and sauces, which means demand stays steady even as costs shift underneath it. Dairy market reports have consistently flagged feed and processing costs as ongoing pressure points, and canned milk products tend to reflect those changes with a bit of a delay compared to fresh dairy. I noticed this one because my mum always keeps condensed milk on hand for baking, and when I visited last month, she mentioned the price had jumped noticeably since the last time she restocked. That conversation got me checking prices at my own store, and sure enough, the trend held. It wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent enough to matter over a year of regular baking and cooking. We ended up comparing notes on 3 different stores between the two of us, and the pattern showed up in every single one. That's usually a good sign. It's not just one store having a bad month. If canned milk shows up in your regular recipes, especially around the holidays, it's worth grabbing a few extra cans when you see a fair price rather than waiting until you need it urgently. This is one of those quiet staples that people only think about right when they need it, which is exactly when prices tend to be least in your favor. Getting ahead of it, even by a few weeks, makes a real difference. Item number 10. Canned soup. I wanted to close the list with this one because it's probably the most universally recognized canned item on the shelf, and that familiarity is exactly why people stop paying attention to it. Chicken noodle, tomato, vegetable. These are comfort staples, and shoppers tend to buy them out of habit rather than checking the price each time. Industry pricing trackers have shown steady upward movement in canned soup over the past couple of years, driven by a mix of ingredient costs, packaging, and transportation. I started paying closer attention to this after a stretch of being sick last winter and going through soup faster than usual. When I went to restock, I genuinely did a double take at the total on my receipt compared to what I remembered paying. Since then, I've made it a habit to stock up when soup goes on sale, especially heading into the colder months when I know I'll actually use it. I even set a reminder on my phone now for early fall, just to check soup prices before the cold weather rush hits and everyone else is buying at the same time I am. My suggestion here is straightforward. Buy soup when it's discounted, not when you're already out and need it that day. It stores well, and having a small backup supply means you're never paying full, undiscounted price out of urgency. This is a comfort item, but it's also a really good example of how easy it is to let a familiar product quietly get more expensive without ever questioning it. Once you start checking, you start saving. So here's the pattern I want you to walk away with. None of these items disappeared. None of them got banned or recalled. They just got quietly more expensive, one small increase at a time, while most people kept buying on autopilot. That's really the whole story behind this list. It's not about panic, and it's not about clearing out a store shelf. It's about noticing the pattern before it fully hits your wallet, and making a few small, smart decisions while you still have the option. The shoppers who stay ahead of this aren't doing anything dramatic. They're just paying a little closer attention, stocking up when prices are fair, and rotating what they already have instead of buying under pressure later. None of this requires a big pantry or a huge budget. It just requires noticing before everyone else does, and acting a little earlier than the crowd. Most people will notice these changes eventually, usually right at the checkout line, when it's too late to do anything about it. You don't have to be one of them. If this was useful, go ahead and subscribe, because I'm going to keep digging into this kind of thing regularly. There's a lot more of this quiet pattern happening across the grocery store that most people haven't clocked yet, and I want you to see it before everyone else does. Drop a comment and let me know which one of these surprised you the most. I have a feeling it's going to be number 7 for a lot of you, just like it was for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.